He stepped into the lobby where the chandelier light looked like poured champagne on polished stone, and the carpet softened each footfall, as if the room itself wanted to absorb evidence. He carried no champagne. He carried a small ceramic pendant in his pocket and a plan that did not require anyone's permission. The St. Anthony had seen weddings and wars at a distance, oil money and civic pride parading in borrowed elegance. Tonight, it would watch arithmetic do something irreversible. He had rehearsed the sequence in his head until the steps lost their fear and kept only the weight. This was not a night for absolution. This was a night for subtraction. His name had purchased distance for years. Martin Ortega, 34. A millionaire before he had become a reliable adult. He had built a platform he once described, at least to himself, as neutral. He had engineered anonymity with tidy competence. Where others bragged, he pretended to be tired of talking, and tired silence looked like integrity. He believed markets were mirrors that showed desires, not creators that birthed harm. He kept everything compartmentalized: node, key, channel, client, fee. In his personal ledger, the words that mattered were throughput and velocity. Then his father died, and grief unplugged compartments. It left pools of uncounted residue. The neighbors brought food and stories. One story refused to leave. A boy from 2 blocks over had found easy credit through a shadow route. When the promised exit vanished, the boy left school, and his mother sold the guitar his father had bought with overtime. The story had no grand tragedy. It had a slow leak. His platform made slow leaks profitable. The day he admitted that felt functional and felt like an injury. The confession did not go to a priest or to a camera. It went onto a page. It became lists, names where he had them, categories when names were impossible. He began allocating money outward in quiet lines, and each line metabolized a little shame without anyone else noticing. But the city had noticed him. San Antonio wanted a story with redemption and polished glass. The St. Anthony wanted another gala. The paper wanted a headline that did not need a second paragraph. He met the director of the Contemporary Art Museum because she did not come with a headline. Gabriela Salazar looked at his lists and saw what they could do if they left his control. Not for an institution, but for people who would never walk these carpets. She told him the museum was tired of seeing money arrive with scripts attached. The board was tired of being told which plaque would heal which sin. She did not promise him safety. She did not promise protection. She offered a witness. He accepted the witness because the alternative was another year of clean shirts layered over old noise. The arrangement was simple in writing and punishing in execution. Independent auditors, a notary with a backbone, an irrevocable trust that would not wait for his second thoughts, a set of public-facing transactions that anyone could follow through their transparent thread. Redacted logs, scrubbed of identities, but checkable enough to show pressure points and the flows that had made him rich. No speeches, no microphone, no absolution for the audience. He did not want applause to feel like payment. He wanted loss to feel like cost. For weeks he woke before the sun and walked the same loop from the Pearl down to the River Walk, counting steps to replace intrusive arithmetic with straightforward metrics. He would reach the water by the time the first tour boats slid past in a hush. He would pass the bakery and buy breakfast tacos and keep the extra napkin in his pocket because the body sweats when the mind does math. He wore a cheap scent with a note of bergamot because it reminded him of an old barber and because expensive cologne felt like a costume this year. He stopped carrying the handsome notebook he had bought in a mood of resolution and carried a beat-up pad instead. Pages tore without ceremony, lists filled without apology. The ceramic pendant clicked against a key when he walked and kept him from disappearing into abstractions. Small objects had a way of anchoring focus. The enemy did not come from the shadows. He wore daylight well. Caleb Sterling chaired the board of a city fund with a benign name and a toothy committee. His family's money came from wells that did not always know when to stop. He used charm as a lubricant and morality as a leash. He liked to accept checks with one hand and power with the other. He arranged this gala as a civic rite in which the wayward would be guided back to the fold. He arranged it at the St. Anthony because rooms with history could confer borrowed innocence. He arranged it because he wanted to demonstrate without saying it that even a man who had built a ghost market would kneel for polite society when the lights went up. He thought of the museum as a grateful recipient of oversight. He thought of the city as an audience that could be led by staging. Martin understood staging. He had worked for years to keep staging minimal because visibility draws heat. He had learned that most people obey the frame. He had lived inside frames built to protect him. He decided to step outside one carefully. The gala would present a stage. He would refuse script while using light and sight lines. He worked with Gabriella and with the auditors to identify an hour when the procedural architecture of the event would be vulnerable to interruption without blowing it into theater. He did not want a microphone. He wanted a system to execute where everyone could see, and the seeing itself would constitute the message. He wanted observers to become witnesses without being asked how they felt. The day arrived with heat that pressed against stone and made the air smell like dust warmed in a kiln. He woke early and walked. He kept his steps even and small. He ate slowly. He thought about the boy who had lost a guitar. He thought about his sister and her son and the way caution had replaced laughter in their house. He thought about a ledger with lines that could be crossed out only by drawing new lines that hurt in different ways. He put on a dark suit that fit because he had not allowed himself to change size during the last year. He put the ceramic pendant in his pocket because his hand needed something honest to touch. He entered the St. Anthony through the main doors and did not use a side entrance because neutrality in approach mattered to his body. He looked at the people gathering their composed smiles. He looked at glassware that trembled when someone leaned against a table. The room sent up the static of money about to pretend it was virtue. He saw the photographers decide angles. He saw the writers decide adjectives. He looked at an empty chair near the front and allowed himself to acknowledge the shape of a plan that could not be stopped by speeches. He went to a side room where the equipment had been installed under a simple pretext. The pretext was believable because it looked like simple stagecraft. Screens, a network terminal mounted on a wheeled stand, a small table with a printer for receipts, a notary who had been told to expect signatures and had already checked identification 3 times with quiet formality, an auditor who had come with a separate machine and tried not to look like a referee. The museum director arrived with a folder that contained letters no one here would recognize. These letters were not donations. They were acknowledgments written by people who had received boring, non-photogenic help. A month of rent to prevent a slide, a phone replaced so a job could be kept, a hospital bill corrected into a plan. Each letter named a result rather than a benefactor. The folder would not be opened under chandelier light. It would be handed to the notary because institutional memory requires paper. Martin reviewed the trust documents again. The trust would hold assets and burn bridges. It would carry instructions that froze decisions. It would distribute to specified categories with named intermediaries who had refused the board's offers to supervise them. It would publish a digest of activity at regular intervals without waiting for permission. It would declare in small, precise sentences that the donor relinquished control and narrative. It would carry clauses that prevented amendments until independent counsel and a court agreed that amendments served the beneficiaries more than the donor. It would operate like an apology, not like a stage cue. He initialed where he had left flags. He did not allow himself to think about watches or cars or the sheen of objects he had bought to organize loneliness. He told himself that memories survive without ownership. That sentence felt sentimental and untrustworthy. He rephrased it more harshly. Objects go, people stay wounded. He could interfere with one category of facts tonight. He walked the prearranged route through the lobby again. He paused at a table that displayed auction lots, not because he wanted anything, but because he needed to see objects one last time and make sure the labels carried an accurate description of the source and the destination. The labels mattered more than the items. If they used the passive voice, he insisted on revision. If they buried the point, he insisted on a stronger noun. He found one label that had been softened by an overzealous hand. He brought it to Gabriella. She corrected it with a pen. The correction looked ugly and honest. He preferred that. The symbolic architecture of the evening settled into place. Ushers did their work. Music started and stopped in a suburban key. The crowd held itself with the intimacy of people accustomed to being observed. The city's hunger for stories settled on him like a polite gaze. He felt the old rhythm that whispered to stay still and let the event convert him into something digestible. He refused the whisper. He stayed near the wheeled stand and counted breaths until the scheduled moment. When the timing aligned with the structure of the program, the screens woke, not in a dramatic burst, in a simple way that allowed the eye to adjust without jumping. Numbers appeared. References appeared. He had argued for formatting that offered intelligibility even to those who had never looked at anything more technical than a bank statement. The first set of transactions went out in a chain that distributed to city programs that had long been starved because donors prefer naming rights to maintenance budgets. The second set went out to funds defined by categories of harm caused by the thing he had built. Treatment assistance for those who had become chemically dependent in cycles that were facilitated by services his platform had made frictionless. Legal navigation assistance for those who had been trapped by fine print in predatory schemes that had piggybacked on his architecture. Debt relief for families who had lost footing when easy money had become impossible money. No names appeared. Identifiers did. The auditor nodded each time a confirmation arrived. The notary watched timestamps and wrote in a slow, prescriptive hand. The printer pushed out its neat squares. Receipts piled. Photographers pointed but could not translate what they saw into glamour. The movement of value was visible and final. It did not return to him after applause. It did not change course in a back room. It left like water released from a reservoir and followed channels that he had paid other people to verify. He felt a hollowing as each block finalized. He had asked to feel it. A man who has eaten off the city's plate should feel the hunger he caused when he pushes his own food away. He kept his eyes on the screens and not on faces. He did not want to confuse consequence with spectacle. The third sequence triggered the upload of a digest. That digest was the redacted log he had sworn to publish. It showed, in simplified, readable graphs, where flows had peaked and which categories of transactions had been most profitable. It pointed out the oblique correlations between platform features and behaviors that had harmed people in non-cinematic ways. The digest did not boast about detection rates or compliance efforts. It acknowledged failures. It made clear how he had chosen revenue over friction at specific forks. It did not pretend the market had forced his hand. More than one graph made him angry at himself in fresh language. The room went quiet in a way that suggested people were watching a sport they did not fully understand and trying to decide which muscle group to flex. The fourth sequence signed the trust into life and put the remaining assets under rules that did not ask his future self for good faith. The notary raised an eyebrow when the irrevocability clause populated. The auditor checked the wiring instructions to the custodian and pressed a separate key that locked the whole arrangement. A small, absurd thought passed through Martin's head that the wheeled stand looked fragile enough to tip, and he should protect it with his body. He resisted the impulse to dramatize. The architecture did not rely on the stand. The architecture lived in documents and systems that had been built across weeks of quiet tedium. The stand was just a place to watch. Caleb moved through the crowd with a precision that belonged to a man who kept rooms compliant through attention and warmth. He stood within the frame of the screens and manufactured serenity. He spoke to those near him with the brightness of a man rescuing a program from chaos. He had planned to announce his stewardship. He had prepared to demonstrate generosity. He found himself sidelined by execution that did not ask for an introduction. He placed a hand near the cable and thought better of touching it. He stepped back when he saw the notary make eye contact that did not invite interference. He calculated the optics of obstruction and saw the story turn against him. He saw the museum director standing still in a dress that did not flash, and understood that standstill could defeat choreography. The crowd behaved like a neural network given a new label set. It rewired slowly and then suddenly. It saw money leaving a man's reach and not returning to a board. It saw an institution watch rather than direct. It saw a sponsor glare with sick politeness and fail to adjust the frame. It felt a room full of power discover the difference between control and exposure. It did not know whether to clap. It kept hands near glasses and near phones. It recorded. It redistributed its attention to include the notary's pen and the auditor's small, relentless nods. It allowed itself to witness mechanics rather than performance. It learned in real time what a civic room looks like when it is forced to admit that cameras cannot convert every act into content that can be priced. Martin kept his face empty. Inside, he collected sentences where he could lay down a coarse blanket and sleep later. He told himself that he had removed the option to hedge. He told himself that the program would guarantee relief and not teach the city to wait on benefactors who might change their minds. He told himself that he had done the hardest public portion, and the hardest private portion would begin in the morning when no carpet muffled his steps. He held the pendant to keep from naming these sentences out loud where they would rot into slogans. He kept his eyes away from Gabriella because gratitude would complicate the posture. He looked at the printer again because its appetite for paper felt correct. He noticed motion at the edge of the room. Reporters had gathered without jostling. Investors had moved toward an exit with the faux casual air of money assessing a fire door. Board members had changed their shoulders. A city official who preferred ribbon cuttings to numbers maintained a smile with visible effort. A curator from the museum stood with both hands clasped and made a shape with her body that said, "Endurance without drama." The photographer who knew his ex looked at the screen, looked at him, and did not attempt a moral portrait. None of that required words. The rooms you respect are the rooms where turning your head counts as speech. The event program attempted to resume. It attempted to invest the rest of the evening with normalcy. It failed in a quiet, thorough way. The silent auctions continued, but the items felt like props from a play that had closed. People lifted plates that had been set with conscientious taste. Food mattered and did not matter. Music resumed without a name. The architecture of civility reasserted itself because that is what institutions do when confronted with an uncooperative fact. They resume. They wait for time to blur the edges. Martin understood that much of his work would be to refuse to wait. He would have to wake and move money and accept that making amends is not a finite project, but a sustained posture. He left without a victory lap. He left through the same doors. He did not check his phone. He did not look for compliments. Outside, the air had cooled enough to let the heat turn into a memory rather than a condition. He walked the route that felt natural because routes keep bodies from believing that events cleanse. He stopped at the river and counted 3 boats and the way light sits on water when an evening finally admits its fatigue. He thought of his sister's son doing homework at the kitchen table and of math that produces a body's ease rather than a company's efficiency. He thought of the letters in the notary folder and of the printer in the ballroom eating a roll of receipts that would tell a story better than any article. He allowed himself to imagine going home and not performing contrition for the mirror. He would wash his face and drink something hot and open a notebook and make another list. The morning after did not grant relief. Relief is too generous for the second day of consequence. The morning after gave him a clean slate of problems. He had to speak to his sister, and to the museum, and to lawyers, and to people who had seen him on screens and had decided to assign him a role in their nervous systems. He had to answer with small sentences that did not attempt to make promises he could not keep. He had to refuse television without being rude. He had to submit to a radio show that cared only about fact patterns. He had to answer a request from a reporter who wanted to see the digest with an expert and was ready to be taught what it meant. He had to explain to an old partner why he would not protect him from a civil complaint because protection had become another name for theft from a stranger. The boy with the guitar did not write. The mother wrote a message that did not flatter. She wrote that the guitar had found its way back through a cousin's generosity. She wrote that no money would replace time. He read her message twice and left it unanswered because answers can look like parasites. He wrote the boy's name into a margin and left a blank line next to it. He would fill that line with something unglamorous later. He forced himself to write 2 other names and to fill their lines with simple tasks. He wrote the name of a legal aid office and the name of a counselor who had agreed to add hours if given steady support. He wrote the name of a bus route because ease of movement often replaces 100 good intentions. He left the notebook open on the table instead of closing it with a perceptible sense of achievement. He did not tell himself that the city had changed. He told himself that he had removed one mechanism of harm and had become available to push at 3 others. The math of harm is always additive. The math of repair is always incremental. Days accumulated. The story mutated in the press like stories do. First, it was a spectacle with a twist. Then, it became a test case. Then, it tried to become symbolic until newer symbols appeared. People who had been loud about the invisibility of the dark web wanted to talk. People who made money on talk wanted to extract more from the past than the past had already extracted from him. He kept a small rulebook pinned to the wall near the sink. He allowed himself to engage only when engagement produced a receipt or a shift in a process. He refused anything that smelled like narrative closure. He refused the safety of telling the story too well. He changed little behaviors that had always looked innocent. He walked instead of driving, not to be virtuous, but because he had learned that the body metabolizes shame better with motion than with performative stillness. He counted steps because a mind that liked velocity needed something dumb to hold. He ate breakfast tacos because salt and heat reintroduced him to the idea of a day. He kept the extra napkin because one learns to prepare for human reactions. Once he returned to the museum and stood in an empty gallery before opening hours. He looked at a small installation that featured receipts blown up to the size of posters. Each receipt recorded a modest transfer that made no sense as art until the wall text told a story about systems that function only in visible increments. He did not read the wall text. He looked at the thin paper and felt the printer in the ballroom again, and the way mathematics sometimes rescues itself from abstraction by asking to be touched. Gabriella walked by, nodded once, and kept moving. The nod counted as work. The gallery smelled like the clean side of paint. He left before a docent arrived with a cheerful tone. He did not want cheer around this. He wanted discipline. His nephew turned 8. The boy asked no questions about the news because the adults around him had obeyed a new house rule about leaving the city's noise outside the apartment. The boy showed him a drawing of a river and a boat. The boat had a flag. The flag was blank. He thought about the blank space as an invitation to put a symbol and decided to call it a truce flag, only in his head. He put his phone away and watched the boy build a tower that kept leaning because the table had a wobble. He slid a napkin under the leg, and the tower straightened. He accepted the lesson with irritation that felt healthy. People do not need speeches from men who finally notice tables. Caleb maintained his smile in public and recovered a portion of his control because cities punish, but they also forget in order to proceed. He lost a seat on a committee that had seemed permanent. He gained a hostile profile in a magazine obsessed with the weight of knives in kitchens. He adjusted his habits. He will always adjust. Men like him pivot rather than repent. Martin understood that his own project was not to punish a man who could metabolize punishment. His project was to hold open a path that did not require permission. It required paperwork and stamina. He felt the old thrill when systems responded to pressure and forced himself to label that thrill as dangerous. Thrill asks for applause. The work asks for quiet. Months later, another event attempted to replicate the shape of that night at the St. Anthony. It failed by becoming proud of its courage and clapping for itself in a minor key. He stayed home. He rebalanced a spreadsheet and wrote a check that no one would photograph. He made tea and stood by the window and watched a bus roll past on a route he could now recite from memory. He counted people with nothing in their hands and tried not to pretend he could guess their stories. He reminded himself of the rule that forbids projection because projection is a theft of specificity. He returned to the table and opened the notebook. The notebook had a new page. The page did not offer absolution. It offered lines. He wrote a title that sounded like a business plan and immediately crossed it out. He wrote 3 ugly phrases that told the truth and left them in place. He listed new tasks in an old way. He made some small. He allowed a few to be big, not because he had become heroic, but because he had built a tolerance for the feeling of not finishing. He wrote a sentence in the corner that hurt to look at and kept it there. He wrote that money had been used as insulation and would be used as fuel until the tank ran low enough to force invention. He wrote that repair is not a vibe. He wrote that responsibility is a bill paid without theatrics. He wrote that the city is not an audience, but an organism with nerves that fray under repeated shocks. He touched the ceramic pendant in his pocket with an awkward affection. Objects cannot heal. They can anchor. They can remind. His father had said very few large sentences in his life, and none of them would fit into this room without sounding like slogans. The memory of those sentences worked anyway because they belonged to a man who lived without press releases. Martin stroked the surface of the pendant and allowed himself, for one breath, to want a lighter story. Then he did what a man in his position must do if he wants the city to carry less of his past. He put the pendant down by the mug. He pulled the mug closer. The tea had cooled enough to be honest. He drank. He looked at the notebook. He turned the page. The refrigerator hummed. The bus moved away. Somewhere in the city, a person looked at a receipt and felt an invisible pressure release by a small increment. No camera turned toward that face. No chandelier sighed. None of that mattered. His body learned the feel of nights when rooms do not applaud, because rooms should never have owned that power. He took a pen and circled the word repair and underlined the word discipline, and closed his eyes long enough to reset whatever still pointed him toward display. He opened the window to let in air that had traveled in from limestone and water and exhaust, and a trace of sweet from a bakery that started early. He smelled the city in its unphotogenic mix. He accepted the smell the way a man accepts the sound of his own breath after sprinting too long. He knew there would be more days when he would want to explain and be praised for explaining. He knew the rule against that. He kept to it. The mug sat heavy on the sill. The notebook lay open on cheap wood. The pendant rested between them like an object placed on a scale to remind the owner what weight feels like. The city moved through its night with no appointment to forgive. The room allowed itself to be ordinary. He allowed himself to be a man doing maintenance. The morale did not require poetry. Dirty money cannot be washed by performance. Responsibility begins where narrative ends, at the table, with a pen and a plan that does not ask the world to clap. He wrote the next line and then the next, and did not check his phone to see who was watching.